have some a few questions, and then we'll get to some of the questions from the chat here. But I hear a lot of it's a lot of audiophile guys, right, that say that, you know, subwoofer. I don't like subwoofers because they're slow. You know, the slow bass. Why are you laughing, bro? Why are you
they
laughing?
were just talking about this last week. It was like those idiots talking about fast subwoofer, slow subwoofer.
The bass was so fast it left the room. That's an old one from Tom Hussein at Sound Vision.
So fast it left the room. That's
so
clever.
fast.
I like that.
It's so the bass was so fast that 20 hertz was 200 hertz. Wow.
Right, exactly.
But so here's the thing: is I believe that what's actually happening is that a lot of the 2-channel guys don't have a way to delay their main speakers to keep up with the inherent delay of a subwoofer, because it has DSP processing and has some additional latency.
Boom.
And I would like to know about how much that would be. If, let's say if I didn't want to do anything, I just wanted to kind of guess, add a certain amount of delay. What should I add for an SVS sub?
Well, first we say, does the audiophile even want to apply DSP to the front channels? Right. That's generally verboten. It's like, oh no, I can't do that. But to answer your question, if you're willing to apply DSP to the front channels and you want to compensate for the DSP latency in the amplifier, our DSP chipset runs maybe around 5 milliseconds, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
And if you can convert that to feet, if you want, sound travels roughly at 1,100 feet per second, depending on how far above sea level you are. You can actually figure out what it is, and then you can figure out what the delay, what that actually translates to in physical distance. Say, okay, it's a 5.5 millisecond delay. Sound travels at 1,100 feet per second where I live, and that equates to however many feet. So that's the way to do it if you want to apply a delay and DSP processing to the front channels. The other thing to look at is when you say, is the subwoofer fast enough? We get into a discussion of, what's transient response? Well, if the subwoofer can play the signal, can play the frequency in question, it by definition has adequate transient response because it's playing the frequency, right? If it can't play the frequency, then it doesn't have sufficient transient response at that frequency, but it can play all of the frequencies in the bass bandwidth. So when we talk about subwoofer speed, really what we're talking about is the time domain behavior of the subwoofer. How long does the subwoofer hang around in the time domain after the signal stops? And can you hear that ringing, and do you perceive that as slow or plodding or overlapping with the beginning of the next note? That's really what the audiophile definition of subwoofer speed is. It's not how fast it starts. They all start at the same rate because they're playing the same frequency. It's how long it hangs around afterwards in the time domain. And then we get into, okay, sealed versus ported. And a properly designed sealed subwoofer generally does have better time domain behavior than a ported subwoofer, because the port has a slug of air in it that hangs around at the resonance tuning frequency of the port. And if you ever look at the time domain behavior of a ported subwoofer, you're going to see what hangs out the longest is the port tuning frequency. It's like the tail of the comet, we call it. So the whole thing slows down uniformly till you get to the port tuning system, and then the port hangs around a little bit longer. Can you hear that? Well, if the port's tuned to 20 hertz or deeper, probably not. If the port's tuned to 35 hertz, like we had maybe small brick and mortar subs back in the 80s, they were all uniformly horrible. Maybe you could hear it back then. I think ported subs got a bad reputation on music. One, because they were just crappy brick and mortar designs, just poor subwoofer designs, bad drivers, bad amps, high distortion, but they were also had a very high tuning frequency. So there's a lot of group delay and phase rotation in the audible music bandwidth. and you say, you know what, that sub really kind of sounds kind of slow, sloppy, overhang, plodding, whatever you want to call it, versus a properly designed sealed sub, got that stop on a dime bass. That's what people call it. Well, that's because it's not hanging around in the time domain.
Right. Okay. So then by what I'm gathering here, ported subwoofer is slower than a sealed subwoofer at the frequency because it hangs out.
They can hang around a little bit longer in the time domain, and how
much time are we talking about? Are we talking about fractions of a second, something that people won't actually notice?
At port tuning, sure, you might see 200, 300 milliseconds of time domain delay. Not delay, but it's just ringing.
It's just hanging out there.
Yeah, it's just hanging out there. So you look at, like, say, a waterfall chart and say, all right, let's look at the time behavior of this. It's nice and uniform, and then the port comes on, and you see that little tail of the comet come whirling out into the third axis, and say, okay, the port's hanging around. But if the port's tuned to 20 hertz or deeper, is it really audible? Not really.
Probably not.
And you can prove that. You can say, all right, let's look at the PB16 Ultra, for example, or one of our tunable subs. Let's look at the group delay chart for sealed mode versus ported mode. Well, they're damn near the same, all the way down to about 28 hertz, which means the phase delay, phase rotation, group delay, very similar down to 28 hertz. That's kind of below the music bandwidth, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we say a properly designed ported subwoofer with the tuning frequency pushed way down deep will have very similar time domain behavior as a sealed subwoofer, at least down into the upper 20s. And then they're going to start to diverge. And then really you're just looking at the differences in the design. What does a ported sub bring to the table that a sealed sub doesn't at the deepest frequencies? More output.
See, so I just was looking on this calculator. So what, 5 milliseconds, would that equal what, about 6 feet? Is that right?
Yeah, somewhere in that range, sure.
So if you have to guess. So here's the thing, though. I think that what's happening with the audiophile guys is maybe they're perceiving that delay.
They can hear it. They can totally hear it. Those
can you hear
milliseconds?
You think you can hear? I think 6 feet of difference. If you were to place a sub 6 feet difference, I mean, there might be some different things that happen.
Well, if you think, and let's take it one step further, Joe. What happens if we say, okay, let's compensate for the pure DSP latency of the amp, and we're going to put the subwoofers 6 feet ahead of the speakers and say, all right, we've compensated for that. Does that necessarily take into account, we touched on this earlier, does that take into account the differences in phase response between the speaker and the subwoofer? The answer is no. So are you perfectly time aligning the speakers simply because you've compensated for that 5 milliseconds of DSP latency? No.
Well, that would mean that they have to put the subwoofer 6 feet closer to them.
You could put the sub 6 feet closer,
closer than the main speakers. That would be weird.
I mean,
but then you say, let's look at the phase response of the speakers and the phase response of the subwoofer. Are they the same? The answer is no.
Still probably not. Yeah.
Are they integrating beautifully in the time domain simply because we compensated for that 5 milliseconds of latency? The answer probably is no. So then you start noodling around and saying, well, what if I actually move them less than 6 feet, maybe 5 or 4, to compensate for differences in their phase response, which again gets us back to, are we going to use Room EQ Wizard to measure, and frequency response is king? So you could move the speakers around to adjust for the DSP latency, but you're also really looking at the phase response of the speakers, phase response of the subwoofers, and how nicely they're getting along with each other. Sometimes they don't get along nicely.
I guess I had a wish list for maybe some future iterations of some subwoofers where, because I would like the 2-channel guys, the audiophile guys, to start using subwoofers with DSP, because I think that they would really enjoy the experience. The fact that you can, stuff we talked about, that you can place a sub in various places. Maybe they're sitting in a null, but their speakers need to be there, but you can put the sub somewhere where it's not in a null.
Right.
Things like that. I think that they could really benefit if they were willing. And so I was hoping that maybe a future iteration of somebody's sub would add an RCA output not that they may never use it, but let's say some kind of RCA output where the RCA output had an inherent delay to compensate.
We had that feature. We had that feature on a previous generation of amp platform. Nobody ever used it. It had an adjustable time delay on the line out for the mains.
What?
And it nobody ever used it, so we got rid of it.
Oh man, so Fred says we're not willing.
Sorry, Joe. Sorry.
It was there, and frankly, if you are applying DSP to the mains, you really want something like the mini DSP HD that has the resolution and bit rate to do justice to high resolution audio soundtracks. And our amp just didn't have that back in the day.
I see.
It wasn't able to do justice to the full range signal being sent back out.
So I'm joking here, but how about let's go the opposite direction then. So how about a mode just disables all your DSP? No.
Yeah, you can't. Right? You know what that is? We call that a passive subwoofer. There's no amp in it at all.
I'm joking.
Now, if you can't catch the show, we do have an audio version at anchor.fm/Daily HiFi. So make sure to go on over there if you like to listen to the show.